This study looks at converging evidence for differential specialization and plasticity of language systems. This study was initially published in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2020 from a few different authors, and it is now being presented by myself, Nikki Quinn. The objective and the main goal of this study is to determine how hemispheric specialization and plasticity play a role in language learning and how languages may lateralize in different hemispheres. For some background on this study, it is already known that neural specialization is a key part of neural organization, and that language learning involves both specialization and reorganization. These language processes in the brain use the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. These processes also tend to be left lateralized, as far as we know, but we do know that the right hemisphere is also capable of performing these language processes, but more so at a secondary level and after things such as trauma to the left hemisphere. So language consists of 3 different components. These include visual processing, which is reading, auditory processing, which is speech comprehension, and motor production, which involves speech production and writing. Language learning is also known to affect neural activation patterns, and all these things make language learning a great model for observing adult plasticity in this study. For this study, there were 2 experiments. Each of the experiments had 2 groups, a male and a female language learner group. The first was a cross-sectional study that compared basic and advanced level learners, and the second was a longitudinal study that compared individuals' proficiency in lateralization before and after language training. Functional magnetic resonance imaging was used to determine brain activity in the participants. The participants performed a comprehension task and a production task while in the scanner. Each task was performed with both languages in order to compare each language, and they were done at separate times so to avoid language switching. Stimuli were presented on a screen for the participants, and the participants were given headphones in order for them to be able to hear directions and instructions clearly without as much background noise, and a mirror setup was given to them so they could see the screen well without having to move their head and potentially interfere with this scanning. Here we have a table that shows the participants' demographics as well as linguistic scores. We can see that the age for the cross-sectional study was much higher versus the longitudinal study that trained participants in a new language. That average age was much lower. There were many more females in the longitudinal study compared to the cross-sectional study that had about equal levels. We can see here L1 stands for the native language of the group, and the LN stands for the newly learned non-native language. We can see that these values are not statistically significant, so for their native language, proficiency was pretty much the same between the basic and advanced groups and before and after training for the longitudinal study. However, we do see that there are significant results in differences between the basic and advanced proficiency groups when it comes to the non-native language, and before and after training when it comes to the non-native language in the longitudinal study. So in this graph here, we can see the laterality index. That is a ratio of hemispheric activity, and it compares the non-native language with the native language. We can see that when it comes to verbal production, it's very heavily left lateralized for both the non-native and the native language because it's in this corner here. And then specifically with speech comprehension in this longitudinal experiment, we can see that there was a lot more right hemisphere lateralization going on. And then here for reading comprehension, we can see the changes that had occurred in lateralization before and after training. We can also see similar differences when it comes to the basic and advanced level groups. You can see that there's a lot of lateralization when it comes to verbal production, and then lateralization differs more when it comes to reading comprehension and speech comprehension, which is really interesting to see how this right here, this verbal production, can be so lateralized compared to speech comprehension and reading comprehension. So this figure shows graphs pretty much the same to what was on the last figure. However, it is presented in a bit of a different way to showcase these differences a little bit better. We can see here how this production even might become a bit more lateralized after training, and then we can see the changes here that occur in comprehension levels, and we can see how this has sort of shifted over this way, which shows a difference in lateralization, moving away from left lateralization. And down here we see a difference in reading comprehension and speech comprehension specifically. So there is reading comprehension here versus speech comprehension here. You can see there's a shift right here, and then there is also a shift this way when it comes to speech comprehension, which looks a little bit more significant here. We can also look at it in the basic and advanced proficiency learners that we have here. There is a lot closer lateralization in the basic proficiency group, while the lateralization is a little bit more separate when it comes to the advanced group that is more proficient. And then we can also see this right here changes a lot, the shape between the basic and the advanced. So we can see how these different types of comprehension, or even comprehension and production, shift with greater proficiency in a language. In this study, we were able to see that speech production is lateralized to the left hemisphere with both the native and the newly learned non-native language. When it comes to reading and speech comprehension, however, these are much more plastic and they do not lateralize to just the left hemisphere. In reading and speech comprehension, different languages tend to lateralize to opposite sides specifically, so that one language will take over one hemisphere of the brain and the other language will take over the other when it comes to language processing. For the study, there are a few different applications here. First is, of course, this study provides knowledge on the neural organization of language and language learning. It also provides knowledge on the language learning processes and how lateralization and plasticity play a role in adult language learning. These findings can also be applied to language rehabilitation for patients with neurotrauma that has affected their ability to comprehend or produce speech. There are some critiques of this study, of course. The study only obtained data from a relatively small experimental group, and the longitudinal experiment had a much larger female experimental group, which means that the data was much less representative of the male population. The test could also be performed with other languages to see if different languages lateralize differently, and if differences between the languages affect how each language lateralizes compared to the other. The study also could be expanded upon by comparing language learning plasticity and specialization in adults and in children, and comparing how the processes are different in the two populations. The study, of course, is just the basis of knowledge that we are gaining on this topic, and there is much more that we can elaborate on and discover.